the first thing that an employer has to do is make sure that the environment is a safe one. And there's no perfect answer to this, but you have to, at its core, understand that safety is a critical component of the experience of members of the LGBTQI plus community, because for big parts of our life, we haven't felt safe.
Hi, welcome to Switching Mindsets. This is Anuradha, and I'm speaking to Michael Bach, an internationally recognized thought leader in diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility. With nearly 20 years of professional experience, he's the founder of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion and Pride at Work Canada. He has previously also served as the National Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at KPMG Canada, along with being the Deputy Chief Diversity Officer for KPMG International. Hi, Michael.
Hi, good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. And there's a bunch of stuff I've not mentioned, including your two books, one of which I'm going through right now, Alphabet Soup. So
yes, that resume is just long. It means I'm old.
Well, so am I. So it's okay. I think we're similar age. So a lot of life experience, as we put it.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. It's called seasoned now. We're
seasoned. Yes, I am
seasoned.
Well seasoned.
Yes, we're well seasoned. Yeah. There are a lot of words now. There's senagers, which means we are senior teenagers, although maybe we're not that senior yet, but even then. Yeah.
Oh, getting close. Does that mean I get to act like a teenager from now on?
Anytime.
Fantastic.
That you can do all your life. Yeah. Yeah. So, there's a bunch of stuff to talk about, especially before we start, I have to start with this alphabet soup. So I'll read out the longest that I found. I just know LGBTQIA plus, right? So you've written here a bunch of stuff. One of them is LGBTIQCAPGNGFNBA, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so
That's a doozy.
yeah, it's really long. And so I'm not going to make you tell us. I'm sure it will be difficult even for you. But there are a few
We'd be
things
here for a while.
yeah, we'll be here for a while. So there are a few things now, I didn't know that queer and gay are not interchangeable. Is that
No, they're
right?
not.
Okay.
Well, they are for some people.
Yeah.
If there's one lesson to learn about the alphabet soup that you've just described, it is that everyone makes their own decision about what those terms mean to them. The term gay is intended to be used by people who identify as men who are romantically, sexually, or emotionally attracted to other people who identify as men. We still see people of different genders, women, people who are non-binary, gender diverse, etc., who will use that terminology because they're not necessarily comfortable with any of the other terms. The term queer is meant to be an umbrella term to describe sexuality and gender broadly beyond straight and cisgender. And I think the intention when it was reclaimed, because of course it was a pejorative, the intention when it was reclaimed was that it would replace all of the other letters. Rather than saying LGBTQIA or whatever acronym or initialism that you use, we would just say queer. And for some people, that's what they do, and other people, they weren't comfortable with the term. So the language is evolving, and each term is unique and distinct.
Yes, we are being kept on our toes. So,
That is a way to put it.
yeah. So LGBTQI2, that's what you said, right, in your book? And
Yes.
two stands for two spirit.
Yeah. So when I wrote the book, the Canadian government at the time, because I am Canadian, even though I live in the United States, but the Canadian government was using the term or the initialism LGBTQ2 plus. The 2 stands for two spirit, which is a term used by some Indigenous people, meaning native to Canada or the United States, although I've heard that it has been used by other Native communities around the world, but people who also identify as LGBTQ And it's not used universally. There's some people who are First Nations, Inuit, Métis, Native American, who don't like the term and they use different terms themselves. But I wanted to make sure that we included the two. Now, immediately following the release of my book, like within days, the Canadian government changed the initialism that they used to 2S LGBTQI plus. But it was too late to change my book. So I'm using an initialism that is a bit outdated, but it's not like I can go back and rewrite every book that's been printed.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I also liked was Gender Fabulous. You said it was made up,
Mm,
created by Kai Scott and Drew Dennis, consulting
yes,
the
two
gender space. Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful people who work in the gender space, Kai and Drew, who I have just such admiration for, and they came up with the term gender fabulous to describe people who are not cisgender. And I'll for your listeners, I'll explain what that term means. Cisgender, CIS, gender. Cis is Latin. It essentially means the same, whereas transgender is Latin. Trans is Latin, and it means the opposite of. Now, the problem is that there's a whole lot of identities beyond transgender. And so they came up with this term gender fabulous to describe people from different gender backgrounds. And I love the term. I think it just is a fun way to talk about gender and acknowledge it in a positive way. You know, the difference is good. We want to see, if, you know, there's an old saying, if everyone's thinking the same, then no one's thinking. And unfortunately, it's from General Patton in the United States. But it is to the point that there's lots of different perspectives, and we should encourage that.
Yeah. So, stupid question maybe, but can cisgender people also use the term gender fabulous? Can we also be gender fabulous?
I think so. I think so. I think we just need to be careful when when we to understand what we're talking about. That the term gender fabulous is meant to describe people who are gender diverse outside of being cisgender.
Right.
It's not a term to be used exclusively by people who are gender fabulous. I would use the term gender fabulous, not necessarily to describe myself, but it can be used by anyone. I don't think language is exclusive to anyone.
Yes, we must be aware of the intent, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah. And the acronym you said, and it's different from initialism, right? You've explained that also. I like
Yes.
that. Yeah.
This is one of those pieces of trivia that I absolutely adore.
I love
And
trivia.
right, it's the silliest of things. I'm never going to use it for any means, but an acronym is a set of characters that come together that actually form a word, like NASA, which of course stands for the North American Space Agency. Whereas LGBTQ, whichever one you use, is an initialism because you can't make a word out of it. And I just feel like that's a piece of trivia that everyone should have in their brain for no apparent reason.
Yeah, I feel like I studied for an exam. I suddenly know so much more than I did before I picked up your book.
Oh, that's so wonderful to hear.
Yeah. So there's the acronym SOGI, right? That's or SOGI. That's sexual
SOGI,
organ.
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sexual orientation and gender identity. You don't see that one as often. I used to see it in legal circles and academic circles quite a bit. And I think SOGI is probably a better way to talk about this subject, only because when you say SOGI, you're talking about all sexualities and all genders. So you are including straight and cisgender people. But we don't see that one used terribly often.
So I think what I should have asked you right in the beginning, tell me about your journey. And you've written very candidly about your journey of coming out
Mm.
and how you tried to present yourself as straight and then bisexual, and then finally you came out with it, and how that set you free,
Yes.
really.
Yeah, it was definitely a journey. So I was born in 1971 at a time when homosexuality had only been decriminalized in Canada at that time since 1967, so 4 years. And obviously not that I was gay as a baby, but it became very clear very quickly that I was not like other boys. You know, I wanted to play house. I didn't want to play construction. I liked dolls. I liked figure skating, not hockey. I did not tick the boxes of a stereotypical masculine child. And jump forward a number of years, when I was in high school, I started to realize what that meant, and that it meant that I was likely gay. But because of the time and because of the bullying and homophobia that I faced on a regular basis, I came out as bisexual and was pretty determined that I could have my dalliances on the side, but I would still marry a woman and I would have babies and I would, live that traditional quote unquote lifestyle. And I did get married to a woman in the 1990s. And so that's a very long story, probably for another podcast. And we only lasted a few years before I realized that no, in fact, I was gay, that both my romantic and sexual attractions were towards men. I think my journey was indicative of a few things. First of all, the time, we're talking 1980s, 1990s, beginning of the AIDS epidemic, lots of countries where my identity was illegal, at the very least not embraced, including Canada and the United States. And there was a lot of fear, and that drove my behavior. And then I would also say that decades of bullying and psychological abuse left me in not a great place with my self-esteem. And so I tried to undo things. I tried to, be someone else. And it didn't work so well. But fortunately, I came out and I ended up working for a person who was the first openly gay politician in the province of Ontario in Canada. And I figured if he could do it, I could do it. If he could be out not just to the city or the province, but to the world, that I could at least be out in my own little sphere. And that led me to a really passionate journey about inclusion of LGBTQIA plus people, that I want to make sure that people don't have the same lived experience that I did. I don't want people to go through what I did. And so I've sort of committed my life to doing that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting that you've written that in 71 countries in the world, being gay or lesbian is illegal. In 15
Mm-hmm.
countries, being trans or gender diverse is illegal. So I'm just saying that because, all around you in popular culture, you hear about mainly Hollywood stars, maybe, all the time people are coming
Right.
out and experimenting. So it seems like, I mean, what's there to come out anymore, right? But apparently it's this, I mean, it's still not so easy for people, right?
It's not. And when we talk about that list of countries, and I actually think it's down now from when I wrote the book in 2022, it was 71. It's now 64 countries where it's illegal to be gay. It's not just problematic in those countries. It's also problematic in countries where it's not illegal, but it's certainly not societally acceptable. I'm thinking about China as an example, where it's not criminalized, but at the same time, you do not talk about being LGBTQIA plus. And then there's also places in countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, the U.S., etc., that are themselves not terribly friendly to queer people. I actually just heard a story this morning. I live in Palm Springs, California, which is probably one of the gayest cities on the planet. Over half of the population are members of the LGBTQI plus communities. And at the dog park this morning, someone was telling me that someone was at the park last night with their dog, and yelling homophobic slurs at people in the park. Now, this person probably was dealing with some mental health issues, but that was today in one of the most progressive cities on the planet, in a very progressive country, and we're still dealing with it. So, as much as we would like to believe it's really easy for people, there's still a lot of challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me, how can you, there are, I'm sure, a lot of positive spaces, safe spaces, right, for the community.
Mm-hmm.
But how can you do that in a workplace situation? Like that's what your book also talks about, and that's what, I mean, uh, professionally, that's what you've tried to do, right, for companies. Uh, as an advocate for diversity, inclusion, you work for KPMG and several other places. So what is your experience of, you said that first you need to create a safe space and only then try to attract talent and then retain them. Other chances are they're going to come in and I mean, they're going to be at the brunt of a lot of, what do you call it? Biases and prejudice.
Homophobia,
Yeah.
discrimination, whatever you call
Yeah,
it.
exactly. So how does one create that safe space? And tell me, what have you seen in your experience? Are there any happy stories of, creating those positive spaces?
Sure. So the the first thing that an employer has to do is make sure that the environment is a safe one. And there's no perfect answer to this, but you have to, at its core, understand that safety is a critical component of the experience of members of the LGBTQI plus community, because for big parts of our life we haven't felt safe, because there are people like the person in the park who feel entitled to judge people for who they are, for their sexuality, for their gender, and feel like those people, members of the community, are somehow less than and less deserving. So employers have to understand that safety is a critical aspect of our ability to exist. The work around safety starts with things like policies and procedures, making sure that you have the policies in place that speak to the inclusion of members of the queer community in things like anti-discrimination policies, code of conduct, and what the behavior is expected of individuals. It has to be defined. People then have to be educated on those policies and procedures so they understand what the rules are. You have to have a zero tolerance policy to make sure that people who commit not just one, but multiple offenses are no longer welcome in your organization. And then you have to educate people. You have to educate people on what it means to be part of an inclusive space, understanding that for some people this is not natural behavior, and it's people just don't understand. There are lots of studies on this, but one that I was part of in 2015 found that the vast majority of, I think it was somewhere near 70% of straight cisgender people didn't believe that there was discrimination against members of the LGBTQ plus communities. However, in that same study, we found that nearly 70% of the LGBTQ plus respondents had experienced or at least witnessed discrimination. So there's a disconnect, and we need to help our straight and cisgender colleagues understand what their role is in creating an inclusive space. Because the policies and procedures, the piece of work that the employer can do, there's only so much that an employer can do. Workplaces are only as inclusive as the people in them. And if the people in them want to be inclusive, they can be. But if they want to be exclusive, they can be. And so there is a lot of onus that needs to be put on the individuals and their behavior, so that those people within that workplace are acting inclusively to create that safe space. Then and only then will members of the community feel comfortable coming out.
Yeah, what are these questions that a company or somebody who's handling the policy can ask themselves? Like you said, like adoption policies, right? It should be across the board,
Yep.
whatever the orientation of the couple, right? Then even questions like, oh, like, if you meet somebody who's trans, you say, oh, have you got surgery? Because I couldn't make out looking at you, right? So
Right.
things like that.
Exactly.
What are the questions? Yeah.
So I think the first thing is around language in your policies. Do you use gender neutral terminology or do you use he/she? Do you have a maternity leave policy versus a parental leave policy? Understanding that maternity leave is a very specific piece of legislation in most countries that speaks to the birth of a child by the biological mother. But parental leave is a very different thing because it encompasses all parents, single parents, parents of same-sex couples, any number of things, surrogate parents, adoptive parents. Those simple things send a big message to people. Do you include specifically sexual orientation and gender identity as protected groups in your code of conduct? That's the first piece around the policies. In terms of the process, that's where you have to educate people, like your recruiters, as an example. You suddenly find yourself in an interview with a person that you think might be gender diverse, and you start asking questions about their surgery, about their genitals, about all sorts of things that you would never ask anyone else. But maybe you're curious, maybe you're transphobic, who knows what it is. You have to understand what it means to create an inclusive experience in the recruiting process, an inclusive experience for a hiring manager, for, what happens if an employee who's been with you for 20 years suddenly decides to transition genders? What's that experience going to look like? So you have to make sure that, you have a gender transition plan in place in advance of someone transitioning so that you know what that's going to look like. It's, again, very foundational work. You have to look at every aspect of your people processes, your HR processes, and determine if there is the potential for bias and discrimination, or if you're being inclusive of everyone. And I want to emphasize that this isn't about special treatment. It's about making sure that you're not excluding anyone, because you may be inadvertently or deliberately excluding someone, and you might not be aware you're doing it.
Yes. I think, yeah, what you said, recruiters have to be trained. And I love that, if somebody's transitioning, there has to be a transition plan in place. Everyone has to be aligned, on the same page. You've
Mm-hmm.
also, you've mentioned Birds of All Feathers, which I have not read. Okay. uh, because you've mentioned in horror that, oh, if you've not read that book, so I have not, I'm admitting.
Talk about a guilt trip, right?
Yeah, 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 absolutely. No, I have to go back and pick that up. So anyway, you've talked about the five F's continuum, okay? The five different groups that you may be dealing with in your organization. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So it's not my model. I must confess. It is a model that I have seen over the years. I was introduced to it at KPMG, and I've yet to find the source of it. But not the point. The 5 F's is a model that we use from a change management perspective to understand where people may be on the journey of change. And it goes from left to right. Let me see if I can do this from memory. Fighter, foe, fence sitter, friend, and family. So your family are people who've bought in, they're actively participating in inclusion, they believe in what you're doing. Your friends are people who they're allies, but they're not actually active allies. They're just going to be like, yeah, this is awesome. And then they don't do anything. Fence sitters, this is where the majority of people sit, is on the fence. They don't necessarily see, they don't have a problem with inclusion of LGBTQIA plus people, but at the same time, they're not doing anything to make the environment more inclusive because they don't see how it impacts them. And then you've got your foes and your fighters. Your foes are people who are against the inclusion, and the fighters are people who are actively working against the inclusion. These are people who are blatantly homophobic and transphobic. who, think it's whatever, they disagree with everything. And it's a model that I've used whenever I'm working on a project to figure out where someone might be coming from and then figure out how to address those individuals. So, what solutions can you bring forward to help move them along the continuum towards being friends or family? And as I tell everyone, the easiest group is the fence sitters. They're not against what you're doing, they just are kind of lazy. So focus on your fence sitters, get them to over to friend, your friends over to family. Your fighters and your foes are going to be the hardest groups because they are entrenched in their belief system. But the good news is that they're a small minority of people. They're not in the majority. So I always say save your energy, focus on the foes and the fighters when you have extra energy. But if you can, the good thing is if you can get the fence sitters sort of over the fence into that position of friend or family, the majority of the population in your organization will be focused on making sure that it's an inclusive space. And your foes and fighters will stop having allies that they can go to and complain about and try to get on their side, because people are always saying, hey, you know what? You're welcome to your belief, but I'm not with you. And I always describe the foes and fighters like fire, another F. When you take oxygen out of the room, fire goes out. And that's what happens with your foes and your fighters is if you take away that environment for them to complain and discriminate, then they will sort of peter out and cease to exist. They'll leave your organization or they'll just keep their beliefs to themselves.
That's smart, really smart. So they have nobody left to crib to really or complain to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very smart. But
Bullies need an audience.
yes.
Bullies always need an audience. And if you take that audience away, they just kind of blink out of existence.
Yeah, great. But tell me any examples of, sorry to put you on the spot, but any examples of, converting any of these groups over to family or friends?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in my 20 years of doing this work professionally, I've seen lots of examples of people, particularly the fence sitter to friend and family. And it's not specifically LGBT related, but I remember this one time. It's a long story, but I'll summarize it. So my organization I worked for was doing a offsite meeting of the entire HR team, and doing it at a hotel called the Valhalla Inn in Ontario, which was built just before the dawn of time. Like it was an old hotel, and they actually were going to tear it down, but it wasn't an accessible hotel. And I had been doing a lot of work around accessibility and helping people understand what an inaccessible step or inaccessible place looked like. And as we were arriving, pulling up in buses, this one woman I worked with grabbed me and she said, Michael, there's a step to get into the hotel. And there was, in fact, it wasn't accessible for people who use wheelchairs or mobility aids. And, that was an example of somebody who was an absolute fence setter on the issues of accessibility. And I moved her over to friend. She wasn't at family yet, but she was definitely at friend. I also think about a wonderful, wonderful man who I worked with at KPMG, and we asked him to be the executive sponsor of the LGBTQ plus employee resource group. And Peter was straight, middle-aged, cisgender, able-bodied man, white. And he said, why me? And he was a very senior partner in the firm, had a lot of power. And I said, that's why I want you there. Because you are who you are. He was a fence sitter. He didn't see how the work of LGBTQ plus inclusion mattered to him, but through his efforts as the executive sponsor of the network, he became, in fact, we got him all the way over to family, where he became an active ally. And he was advocating for LGBTQ plus inclusion in the workplace to the point where, things sort of just moved past me and others, and it started to happen more naturally. There are lots of stories, and you asked me for a success story, and I want to come back to it because I didn't answer the question. And it's a story that I have told often, and it's one that really sticks with me. There was a person in our firm who was a friend of mine. He was gay, he was South Asian, Indian. And one day we were having dinner, and he said, I stay at the firm because of the work you do. And I thought that was a bit odd to say, but I asked him to explain what he meant. Because he was gay and South Asian, he had experienced a lot of discrimination in his life. And he felt that the environment at this time at KPMG had improved so much because of the work I was doing that he could be himself and succeed in the firm. And he has succeeded. And it was because of work to create an inclusive space. And he was an amazing contributor to the firm. And he really gave back to what he was doing. It improved his engagement, his voluntary turnover, like it had all the intended impacts. So the point of the story is to say that the work does pay off. It requires effort, but ultimately what you see is people are more loyal to your organization, either as employees or as customers, that they are more engaged, they're more productive, they're more innovative, they're more willing to contribute. There are so many benefits to creating inclusive spaces, whether those spaces are inclusive for LGBTQ plus people or frankly for anyone. The benefits are there, and it's just a matter of doing the work.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Beautiful example. And I guess it's good for the company overall, the image, the branding, and everything else, right? In the long run, the bottom line.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Michael, you've been in this field working, on a mission really for so many decades now. Have you seen things change, and how much, positive change have you seen, and where do you see it going in future?
Yeah. There's been lots of positive change. When we think about where the world was when I came out nearly 40 years ago, 38 years ago, to today, it's monumental change. Now that's a big time period, right? 40 years is a human being's life. But we've now seen heads of state who are open about their sexuality and gender. Ireland had a prime minister who was gay. Iceland had a prime minister or a president, I forget which role it is, who was a lesbian. We've seen CEOs of major companies. We have seen laws change. That number of 71 countries in 3 years is down to 64. And in another 10 years, hopefully it will be down to 40, and it will keep dropping. I think the one thing to keep in mind with this work is it is always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And particularly with what we're living through in the United States right now, there's a lot of people who are really struggling and feeling downtrodden, and understandably so. This is we're going through some stuff here, but it has always been like this. When same-sex marriage was brought into Canada in 2005, around half the population of the country didn't support it. That number is now down to below 30% in 15 years or 20 years. I guess it is now 2005. I think it was. Change takes time. It is not instantaneous. What I continue to advise employers is to say, take your time. Slow and steady wins the race. Don't try to achieve miracles overnight, because when the pendulum swings too far one direction, it only has one direction to go back, and that's the opposite side, as pendulums do. So the slower, honestly, the slower your work, the more likely you are to succeed.
Yeah. And the pendulum is swinging, so that's a good sign. Yeah.
It is, yes.
Yeah. Before we end, Michael, I just want to go back to language and how we use it, the importance of language. So how can all of us, be mindful of using the right words, the right terms when we speak?
That's a great question. So, the first thing I would say is don't be afraid to make a mistake because you are going to. Think about pronouns as an example. Using someone's pronouns is just a matter of being respectful. But we are programmed from a very early age, particularly in the English language, but also lots of other languages that use gendered pronouns. We're programmed from a very early age to use that language. And you're undoing your brain. You're undoing years and sometimes decades of programming. You're going to make a mistake. That's okay. The point is to say, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, and move on and learn from that mistake. And I would say that about all language. Just learn from your mistake, learn what the terms mean. If someone says to you, oh, I'm genderqueer, go Google it. Don't ask the person what it means. Go and look it up. Then you can go back to the person and say, I did some research on what the term genderqueer is. Can you talk to me about it from your perspective, what it means to you? And if they're willing to do that, great. You can engage in a respectful conversation. Just learn what the terminology is. Allow yourself to learn. And there's a lot. Like, there's so many terms. And frankly, there are some that I don't even understand. I heard this one just yesterday. Stud. And my husband was looking at somebody, said, what's a stud? And I still don't know what it means. I have to look up what this means. Okay, I will learn what it means. I will respect it. It doesn't mean that I'm changing something or that my identity is less than because of this. It's simply that I'm willing to learn and respect how another person identifies. It's not about right or wrong, good or bad. It's just about understanding that it's not about you and how you identify. If someone identifies as queer or trans or gender fabulous, that's how they identify, and it doesn't take anything away from your identity. So I would just encourage people to have that willingness to learn and make mistakes, but then learn from your mistakes.
Or they can just pick up your book, right? Alphabet Soup.
Or just pick up my book.
Simplest, you made it easy. Thanks
That's
so
what
much,
I'm here to
Michael.
do.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for doing this.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for having me.